Hello, this is Jeremy Tyrrell from UNC Wilmington, and this tutorial is about collecting graduate data with forms. So getting information about program alumni. This is mostly set up for majors, so for undergrad majors who graduate and then move on. But it could also be used for graduate students as well. So let's go ahead and take a look here. So the purpose of doing this, we're going to be collecting data for later visualization. We're going to be making some different charts and maps out of this data. So we want to think about that when we set up our collection tool about what kind of data we want and the formats we want it to be in. We're going to be looking at industry affiliation, so what industry or job graduates enter. We're also going to account for graduate education. It's just going to be treated a little bit differently because some of the questions like salary bracket may or may not pertain, right? So we do want to accommodate that, and we'll have to make sure our form is flexible enough to do that. So we'll set things up accordingly. We're also, of course, going to want to get geography so that we can see in terms of placement where graduates are going, quite literally where they are going. If they're being placed all over the nation or internationally, or if we're serving a local population, excuse me, neither is inherently, or any of those options, none is inherently better or worse. But there may be investments in terms of your institutional or programmatic goals, right? Some state institutions really want you to try and serve a local population, particularly if state institutions are being subsidized by state taxes, so they want to see that that those students are then going to give back to the state in terms of productivity. And this can all seem very sort of mechanistic, but it is part of our institutional impetus sometimes. And programmatically, we can see what students are doing and where they're going, and that will in turn hopefully affect the nature of our program. So that all falls under the aegis of understanding programmatic direction. It'll allow us to, for example, if our students are headed into a particular industry, it'll let us know, okay, well, perhaps we need to serve that industry, or if we want to try and change that and say, well, this is what we think we do better than anyone else, and so we can make these changes, and hopefully it'll be reflected in industry affiliation, including graduate education. But this will give us a diagnostic to know what's going on. And it lets us do it internally. You can't really count on your institution's alumni association. I mean, in most places, that's going to be a fundraising organization, so a lot of people are just going to duck it. We really want to know about these individuals because we want to grow a particular network. So it's more intimate, it's more focused. The goals are different than just a broad institutional alumni association. Lets us know about our actual people. Also aiding recruitment. These things are going to aid recruitment, the nature of our program, but it also gives us tangible information about where people are being placed, in what industries, and what kind of money they're making. And that can seem a little vocational, but it does matter. We shouldn't overlook these things, particularly in terms of maintaining a major or a graduate program. These things are obviously very pragmatic, very important. In terms of tools, we're going to be using Google Forms, which feed directly into Google Sheets. Probably you have some experience with this if you're listening to this. Google Forms is just a survey tool. It's a form tool. You may be familiar with something like SurveyMonkey or something like that. Google Forms is similar. The big advantage is that it's connected to the other Google tools, most tightly Google Sheets. Every Google form will, by default, feed into a separate Google Sheet, a spreadsheet. So you'll be able to get that data in a format that's really usable. I mean, even if you don't end up doing Google visualizations, which we'll be using this for some Google visualizations, different charts and that kind of things, maps, fusion tables. But even if you don't, if you want to use another tool, which we'll also look at some options in terms of open source visualization tools like Gephi, a spreadsheet, any spreadsheet program worth its salt is going to be able to spit things out into a usable format like CVS. That's comma separated values. So those are the tools we're going to be using. There's lots of options, but for our purposes, the Google tools are going to have advantages. All right, that's pretty much it in terms of our goals here. So let's just start looking at compiling the form. And as I mentioned, we want to get productive data that's going to be usable when we are doing our visualizations. Excuse me. And we want to balance our form as well so that it gives us good data, but it's not onerous. You know, a lot of times, even as faculty and staff, you've probably encountered tons of forms. I mean, I get these all the time about, you know, feedback forms. And if they're more than like a page, forget it. I mean, I'm just not going to do it. No one's going to do it. We just don't have that buy-in. So you have to think about this. What's going to be useful for you as a program, but what's not going to be onerous for your target audience? You know, they're not going to wade through a bunch of stuff. And even if they do, that means you're going to get a very idiosyncratic slice, because the people who are going to do that are very motivated for one reason or another. What you want is a broad slice, not a focused slice. Anywho, so let's just go ahead and pull up Google Drive. And again, I mentioned, you might know this as Google Docs, but Google Docs is, that language I believe has been basically retired. Everything now falls under the aegis of Google Drive, because that includes documents, spreadsheets, presentations, maps, fusion tables, images. There's just a lot of stuff under this same sort of language. So here's my sort of top level of my drive. To make the form itself, we just need to go to New, and you'll notice it's not one of the automatically shown options. We just go to More here, and it's Google Forms. And if you're doing this now, this is what you'll see. If you've used Forms in the past, there was a slightly different interface, well, a noticeably different interface, and even how it was stored. Essentially, the form and the spreadsheet were the same document. That's no longer the case. In fact, even older ones that you may have done have probably been updated, whether you wanted that to happen or not. So this is the interface you'll likely see. And you can see we've got some options up here in terms of edit the questions, changing the theme or the visual look to it, viewing responses, which we don't have yet. And then we have just some menu items up here as well. Basically, the way forms work, by default, it gives us this question here. It gives us one question. This will be the form title where it says untitled form, and then the description. We'll be able to add items, and there are different kinds of question type. Right? This default one is the text type. It gives us a line of text. If you need a longer entry blank, paragraph text is your option. There are some other things like scales and grids, dates and times, so particular kinds of entry, different types of multiple choice. Really, all we're going to be sticking to for this example are the text and multiple choice types, I believe. We'll have one or two wrinkles in that. In one of the questions, at least, we want the answer to lead to a different set of questions. So based on a respondent's answer, that respondent will get different questions. In particular, we're going to be looking at if the person is working or going to school, they'll get a different list of questions, because things like salary may not apply if you're going to grad school and you're basically getting a tuition remuneration. Sorry, I was looking at my notes. So anywho, let's look at building this form. We have the title up here, and I've already pre-built the form, so I'm just going to kind of recreate what I've already got. Let me just pull that up here. Yeah. I titled mine Alumni Information Form. Depending on what you want to do with this, if it's this is going to be flexible enough to roll out year after year, but you may want to focus it for undergrads or graduates or whatever. It doesn't much matter. The point is, this title is what will be displayed in the form itself, and then there's space for a description. I just added a few words about privacy, because that will be part of this. You want to assure students that you're not going to share anything too personal, but you do want to stipulate that you're going to be sharing some things. Since this is just a generic form and is not a production form, I just have a statement here about asking the respondent to help us grow our community. I do have an estimation of the time, which should be about a minute, because I want to let them know this is not going to be a big chore. This is not going to be a burden. So there is our title and description. If you click View Live Form at any point, it will give you a live demo of what the form looks like. And you can see we've got a built-in question, which is right here. Before we do that, here on confirmation page, whenever someone finishes their form, it will give them this reply: your response has been recorded. You may want to change that to something custom. I changed it to this: thank you for being a part of the English department's alumni community. We appreciate your time and participation. This is just the message the person will see upon completion. There are also some options down here. Show link to submit another response. I'm going to uncheck that. It's curiously always checked by default. I'm going to uncheck that because I don't want respondents to submit more than one. One will cover it, and I don't want them to get confused. Anything superfluous is a potential issue. So I'm just going to get rid of that. Publish and show a public link to form results. No, I don't want respondents to be able to see results. So I'm going to leave that unchecked. Allow responders to edit response after submitting. You may check that if they accidentally submitted something. You can check that. You don't have to. I'm going to leave it unchecked, but it is certainly an option. And now when we get to our actual questions up here, we don't have to use this question type. If we want to, we can go ahead and change it here under question type. By default, it'll be this text one. I do want this type because the first thing I'm going to ask is their graduation year. I'm not going to ask their name first, just because the sort of semantic order of this, I want it to be classified basically by year and then person. It doesn't really matter the position of these questions. I mean, you know, it's perhaps to a psychometrician it does. But we're not going to be asking that many, and when we get the data, we can always move that around however we'd like. So if you'd like to start with name or contact information, whatever, that's perfectly fine. You can, in fact, rearrange the questions at any point, and then even when you get the data, you can change that in a spreadsheet. So really, our rhetorical issue is, what do we want the respondent to see? I'm going to go graduation year. I am going to, this is not multiple choice, it's text. I am going to click this drop down under advanced settings because right now the person does not have to reply at all to this question. Some of the questions in this form are going to be optional. Some of them are going to be required. And what that means is if they try and submit the form without putting in a response, it'll tell them you can't submit this without completing it. I'll show you an example of that in just a second. But I am going to, it's actually not under advanced settings. That's for validation. We'll be doing that in a second. I'm just going to click this box under required question. Now once it's saved, if you check the live form, it will put this red star next to any required questions, and it'll put this note up here that anything with the red star is required. If I click submit, it's not going to let me. See, this is a required question, so I'll need a response there before it'll even let me submit. Okay, so I've got my graduation year. I know it's required. I'm now going to ask for their name. I'm going to ask for it in two parts. Instead of just their full name, I'm going to get their first and last, because I am going to want to visualize their first name. I'm not going to visualize their last in order to protect privacy. And depending on what you do, you probably want to stipulate when you distribute this form, depending on how you do that, what data you're going to share. You probably want to put it up here in this description just to reiterate. I didn't because this is generic. But you probably want to make it really clear, this is what we're going to use and this is what we're not going to use. As I say, I'm going to be using first names because these are real people, but I'm not going to be using last names. So I need it in two questions, or it's going to be easiest. Excuse me. I can just click this button here to duplicate. And because it's the same type, it's a text type, I don't really need to change much. I'm going to put first name. And I am going to leave that required because I'm going to be sharing those. I need that. However, I'm going to duplicate it here and put last name and uncheck required question, because that, if they don't want to provide their last name, that's perfectly fine. So now if we look at the live form, last name is not required. You would have to put in these two, the first name and the graduation year. You do not have to submit a last name. Excuse me. Okay. Sorry, I've been speaking more than usual. So something else I want, and I'm just going to click add item rather than duplicate. I do want a text answer here for contact email. I'm going to put a note here under help text. This is just something that will appear underneath this question. So what I put is that this information is for internal departmental contact purposes and will not be shared publicly. And you know, since that's also true about the last name, why don't I put that there as well? Here under help text. Let's take a look at our live form now. You see how it's just popped up underneath these? It's just explanatory notes that appear under the question prompts themselves. Now, this contact email question, I could just leave it as a text question and just accept whatever someone puts in. We can, under advanced settings, click data validation. And one of the options here under this drop down, we've got number. But what we want is not a number, it's an email address. So text, and then it'll have options for contains, doesn't contain, email address, or URL. Basically what we're doing here with data validation is making sure that it's a email address, which means basically on the back end it's going to be checking for the @ symbol and probably a suffix. We don't really have any control over that. We just have to click data validation, text, and email address. Now, if I click done here and it saves, this is not a required question. But if I put in this information that is not an email address, it'll say this must be a valid email address. And all it's looking for is format. It doesn't poll a server or anything. So I could put anything I want here, you know, fake at fakeemail.com. That's fine. It's just checking for the structure. It's not actually polling to make sure it's a real email address. It's just doing a formal check. And again, I don't need to put anything, but if I put something, the form is now going to check and make sure it's an email address. You don't have to have that check in there. I just add it. It's more just to, it's more for people that if they accidentally, you know, mistype, it'll let them know. I'm not trying to be draconian. I just want people to be sort of made aware, whoops, you may have typed this incorrectly, which I do constantly, you know, because I write my email address so much, I sometimes kind of mush it and I won't put a period by accident, or it'll be, you know, .c or something like that. Anywho, contact email. I do want their location information as well, and I want that to be kind of specific. I do want it just to be text, and I don't want their, when I say specific, I don't mean precise. I want it in a particular format because I don't want their home address. I don't want their work address. Even asking someone for that is a little odd. I want just really their city and state, because that's about as fine-grained as our map is going to be. Truth be told, I mean, if we're going to be harvesting things like where they're working, we're not going to need a street address anyway. And it'll avoid things where if we're plotting locations on a map, if we just have city and state, then if we provide a city, all of those location markers are going to be on exactly the same point. That can be a little awkward because then you can't see everything that's, you know, that's on that single point. So ultimately, we are going to get a little bit fine-grained with our data, but I don't want to ask people for anything that could be construed as impinging on their privacy. I do want this to be a required question. I'm going to put location, but then I'm going to put in terms of the help text, Please provide only your current city and state, or city and country if international. That's all I want. If people provide more than that, I'm going to clean the data because I don't really want it. I don't want to ask folks to provide that kind of data. And this will give us a good enough visualization. So this is required. I'm only asking for city and state or city and country. If I get more than that in a response, I'm going to clean it out. Okay, and now we're going to try a different question type. And this is actually going to be, as I mentioned before, a branching question. So based on how people respond, individuals respond, they'll get a different set of questions. So what I want to know, this is going to be a multiple choice. I want to know, what are you doing? Are you currently primarily working or furthering your education? Now, obviously, there's lots of other options there. That's really the main things I'm interested in because of the rhetorical purpose of this. I want to show things like where people are working, how much they're making, are they going to graduate school? So because of that, I want to know, are you working or are you furthering your education? This is it's kind of a psychometric issue. What kind of data do you want? How are you going to shape that? Since this is multiple choice, I'm only going to give them particular options. I'm going to do I am working. And this is just going to follow the structure of the question. I'm furthering my education. No response. Whoops. And I am going to make this required. So that's why I have the no response option. You do have to provide some form of response. What if someone isn't working or going to graduate school, they've graduated and now they're at home and they don't really have an answer to this? I still want those people's names and contact info. I want to keep in touch with them. This isn't mercenary. I want to build up our community. And eventually those people will have information for this, presumably. Eventually they will be working or they will be going to grad school or something like that. It could just be this first year or whatever. So I am going to make this required, but I'm giving them the option for no response. I want their other information. It can't really show up in the visualizations that I'm going to do, but I still want to keep tabs on these folks. So it's required. You only have these three options. Now, as I said, we need to make the branching structure to give different questions based on response. The way you do that is simply click this box that says go to page based on answer. Now, right now, you can see for each reply, there is this drop-down box. Continue to next page, submit form, which means, complete, finish it. And go to page 1, which is this. We don't have any new pages right now, so we can't really hook up the pipes, so to speak, because we don't have any other pages. So we're just going to leave this the way it is for now, and we're going to go ahead and build our pages. I'm going to go ahead and follow the same order. So I'm going to start my next page with, if you reply, I am working. What I'm going to do is go here to add item. We're not actually adding a question type. We are adding a page break. A section header is on the same page. It's just a large header that can encompass if there are multiple question sets. We don't have that. We have a page break. Okay, so now we're on our second page here, which I'm going to title, I am working. I'm not going to provide a description. So let's just really quick check out the live form. So notice there's this continue tab, or this continue button right now. There's no submit because we have multiple pages. Right now we do have a page 2 that'll correspond to I am working. We haven't hooked it up yet, but it's there. But this gives us an example of how things look right now. Here on page 2, I want to finish this up. I've titled the page itself, I am working. That'll give people a visual confirmation. Okay, I'm on the I am working page. I'm going to add a text question type. I'm going to put in, please tell us the name of your employer. This is not required. Anything that feels like it may be impinging on someone's private life or anything like that, it may be a good idea not to make it required. This, if they don't want to tell me where they're working, that's perfectly fine. It will give us more focused location data, but it's a give and take with your respondent. You can't force them to do this kind of stuff. Or if you try, they just won't. They'll opt out completely, right? Our next option, I want to now add a multiple choice. And you can see there are some other options here like check boxes and choose from a list. What's the difference between those and multiple choice? If you do check boxes, it means you can have more than one response. I don't want to do that, but you might. I mean, if you're asking about like industry, you may want to have the option to check more than one response. You can do that with a checkbox. Choose from a list. That's going to be like multiple choice, but it's a drop-down list. So visually, it'll look like a drop-down list rather than all of the choices articulated. I'm just going to use a regular multiple choice. We're going to call this industry. And we could provide some help text here about, and because this is English. And so now we should provide a range of industries. Where you get these industries, I like to try and find a third party, like your state's labor board or even a federal labor commission that provides a breakdown of industries. The truth of the matter is, though, depending on what kind of program we're looking at here, there's only going to be a fairly narrow slice, or at least a fairly likely slice of industries that your major graduates are going to be going into, or your graduate students. I like to have a third party. I like to get this breakdown from a third party because then it has, some kind of stamp on it. And then I usually will just winnow it down to a more focused list. I have in the form I generated, I have a list of, it looks like about 12, ranging from arts and entertainment to finance. I'm not going to put them all in right now. I'm just going to sort of give you an example of how this might work. Oops, make sure you put it here. Television. Yeah, it looks like I have about 12 or so. That's all I do is put in these separate responses. I'm not going to walk through it because you get the gist. But that's what I want to know, the name of their employer and the industry. You can also, you'll notice on multiple choice questions, once you've completed your list, if you click this or add other, it will add automatically this optional other that a person can click and then insert a, well, I can't go through this right now. Insert another response there. It's always nice to provide that because, perhaps this person's industry is not covered. One caveat is if things are set up to, fall into these categories when you do your visualization, then you have to sort of account for these others. I have the other on my list. You don't have to have it. Okay. One last thing I wanted to get was, whoops, not paragraph text. I wanted to get their salary range. And, that's gonna range. I mean, one way to find this is to check job listings, right? That's kind of a good way to get a thumbnail sketch of, okay, people are going into these industries. Here's sort of the range. Mine, I have about 10 of these. Mine went from less than 20K, and then it goes by approximately the 10,000 per step, 20 to 29, and then it goes up to 100K or more. That's pretty, well, I mean, it kind of depends on your graduates. It's somewhat unlikely. But of course, in some majors, it's not unheard of. Now, because I have a bunch of these and what we're talking about is just numerical ranges, my next one is just 30 to 39. I'm actually going to use a drop-down question type for this. You can see it's just that. Oops, I need to put in salary range. And I'm going to put some help text here just to let them know that it's confidential. Please select a range that fits your current salary. This information will be kept anonymous. Okay, that's pretty much all I need. Those questions will do it if you're a person who works. So what I want to do is now go back and hook up these pipes, so to speak. If you select I am working, I want them to go to page 2, which is titled I am working. Okay. So now that's hooked up correctly. I'm just going to click done, make sure that gets saved. Whoops. This drop down under after page 1, what do you do? Because this is going to be a branching question, it doesn't matter too much what you put here because it's never going to happen. This question here at the bottom is going to branch. So what happens after page 1, it doesn't really matter that much. We could change this to submit form just to be super safe, but it's never actually going to come into play. Anywho, so we've built our I am working page. We now want to build the page for if you're going to graduate school, which you remember this option up here, I'm furthering my education. That's going to go to a separate page. You're not going to see these questions. You're going to see different questions. So we're going to go to add item here and add another page break. This is called I am furthering education. Capitalized, weird. Oh well, whatever. Just to keep in the same structure, right? So this is I'm working, next page I'm furthering my education. You're only going to see one of these. What I'm going to want here, I'm not going to want salary range, I'm not going to want to know industry because it's all going to be the same sort of industry, graduate education. So I'm just going to want a couple of text questions here. One, and keeping the structure of the questions kind of similar, right? So please tell us the name of your employer for I am working. Please tell us the name of your educational institution if you're going to graduate school or any kind of graduate education, different certificates or law school or whatever. And then we also want another question here, the text type, degree sought. This is information I want. Whether or not this gets visualized, we may or may not cover that in these tutorials, but it's good information to have. Are they all going into a particular kind of MA? Are some folks going into MS programs or different kinds of master's programs, of technology or something like that? Law school, whatever. It's valuable information to have. So please identify the degree you are seeking. You could, if you wanted, make this a multiple choice selection, MA, MS, law school, or whatever. I'm going to keep it like this. I could consolidate this data on my own, depending on how much I'm dealing with, but it's certainly an option to do a multiple choice question here as well. That's it. If you're furthering your education, those are really the only two things I want to know. So we'll go back to this branching question and hook up the pipe. So go to page 3, I'm furthering my education. That means if I select that, I'm going to go to this set of questions. I won't see these I am working questions. Now, if you click no response, and mind you, it's required, so you have to select one of these things, which, what are you supposed to do from here? There's not really, or there aren't really further questions I can ask, because really all I need is that person's name and contact info so I can keep that person in the network. But there's really no information we can glean about this sort of stuff. So I'm going to select this option, submit form. What that means, if you click that response, it's just going to go ahead and finish up. So click I am working. We go to the I am working page. Click I am furthering my education. Go to the education page. Click no response, and it just submits it. Just one or two more things to clean up. Here on this, I am furthering my education. Or excuse me, I am working. See, because these pages are set up to be sequential, but we don't really want them to be, it's branching. Here, where it says after page 2, continue to next page, we want to change that, right? Because otherwise, when you did these responses, it would just go ahead to I am furthering my education. I don't want that to happen. I'm just going to put submit form, and that means if you get to I am working, when you get to the end of the questions, it ends, it stops. That's pretty much it. I think we've got our form completely built here. We do want to run through it just to make sure it looks okay and that all the pipes are hooked up correctly. And then we can deal with niceties like the look of the thing, the theme. Let's view live form here. So this is what everyone will see. And as I mentioned, you probably want to stipulate up here what information is going to be shared and how. Because this is generic for me right now, I didn't. But it's probably something you want to do. You can even reiterate it here in these questions that are going to be kept private. You just want to make sure that you're being transparent with the respondents. But this is what our form actually looks like. I mean, this is the URL. It's live right now. And we can kind of see how it works. If I try to advance, I really can't go anywhere because of these required questions. Right? So graduation year, let's say it's 2013, whatever, first name, I'll put in mine. You know what? Since we're testing, let's call this test working, because this will be somebody who answers this first response. We'll call this test last. Contact email, no, we know you don't have to reply here, but if you put something, it's got to be an email address. Or at least something that looks like an email address. It doesn't have to be real. Now, this is a required question, and this is going to dictate what happens from here. This is our first working test, so I want to select I am working. So I click that and continue. And this takes me to the I am working page. So far, so good. The name of my employer, I'm in education, salary range. That's actually not too far off, is it? I do have to select one of these. Remember, when you actually do this form, you'll want more options here and for the salary range, but since I didn't want to go through the tedium of entering all those in. If I click submit, that should finish things up. I can go back and make changes if I need to. Otherwise, I click submit, and there's our custom message. So great, everything looks good. Now, of course, the question is, yeah, but where did that go? You can see here on our form page, it says responses. Now it says 1 because it's collected 1 response. We can view the responses here, and it gives you, it just basically takes you to the spreadsheet. By default, you don't have to tinker with this, but here under change response destination, by default, it will make a spreadsheet with the same name as your form. So this form is called alumni information form. That means it'll automatically create a spreadsheet here called alumni information reform parenthetical responses. Okay. So that's where this is going. Right into this spreadsheet, it happens automatically. And then, of course, once it's in a spreadsheet, we can do all kinds of things with it. You can also see a summary of responses, but that's probably not going to be super useful for our purposes. It can be useful to get, you see, it goes by question, certain kinds of information. Like here, we get an at a glance of who's working versus who's going to school. There's only one, so it's 100%. And that can be actually useful for sort of your own internal purposes, but you can't really share this in a great way. I mean, we're going to visualize this in a much more impactful way. So this summary can be useful for your own internal purposes, but for sharing, it's not super useful. So we did our first test with working. Let's just quickly run through the other, if we do some other things, just to make sure everything's hooked up the way we want. We know we need a graduation year. We need a first name, so we'll call this test second education. Excuse me. Now we don't need to put in a last name or email, so I'm not going to. I'll put my hometown, furthering my education. Okay, great. So we're going to the I'm furthering my education page. That would be, whoops. Again, I can go back and change, or I can click submit. Okay. As you can see, now we have 2 responses, and we can, now it'll be 50-50. Yeah, it's a little tough to see because they're using shades of blue, but we've got 50-50 there. We didn't change the industry or salary range. And again, that's going to go, going to go right into the spreadsheet. You can see they just stack one under another. We're going to look at handling this data in later tutorials because what we want to do with this is going to vary depending on the specific visualization. But right now we can tell everything's working pretty much as it should. I just want to do one last test. And this time we'll do no response, and this should just basically submit the form. Click submit to finish. That's the only option it's giving us. And there. So everything's hooked up correctly. We have that one branching question, and there we can see it popped in. Usually it'll take just a couple of seconds. Sometimes it'll take a minute or two, but it never takes longer than that, unless something's seriously wrong. So when you're doing your testing, if you're waiting around for hours, something's messed up. So there's our form. You can edit this depending on your own needs, but you get the gist of how it works. The only real quirk is branching. I wanted to have one single form that could accommodate if a person is working or going to school, and that's going to lead to different kinds of data. It's going to translate into different visualizations, but I didn't want to have multiple forms because that would be really awkward for the respondent. You know, if you're doing this, reply to this form. But if you're doing this, reply to this form. No one's going to do that. It's going to get all messed up. Your data is going to be erroneous. So I wanted to have one form that could accommodate these different kinds of things. That just means you have to put in a branching question. And later when we start handling our data, then we can kind of set things up to visualize appropriately. So that's it. What you want to do now is disseminate this. That would be the sort of last question, is how do I share this with folks? It's already live. When you go to view live form, you can just share this URL. It does have built-in capabilities to send this to people. Yeah, where is that? You know, pre-filled URLs if you want to answer some of the questions in advance. We don't want to do that, so we're not going to tinker with that. Oh yeah, there we go. Email or that's for sharing, or embed. You can also download the response as a CSV, and then send form up here is where you can share this, but it's the same URL. Yeah. What that's doing is providing you a link, and it gives you also, you can link through your social networks that you can use to share this with your alumni. Now, you wouldn't want to do it, while they're still in school, because this information hasn't happened yet. I mean, they're not out, they haven't placed, they're not in the world. You probably send this to your alumni, the semester after they've graduated, or even the year after they've graduated. That's kind of up to you. That's I think a sort of fair policy is when you're doing perhaps even your graduation stuff for this year, just do it all at once. Send out the link to this form for last year's folks at the same time as you're doing graduation for this year. So, we have to send out the stuff for our current graduates, and then go ahead and contact last year's folks with this alumni form. That will have given them a year to get, their first job or to move on to graduate school or whatever. All right, so that's enough. This is going on forever. As always, if you have any questions about this, you can certainly, please feel free to contact me at jtyrrell.com. There's contact info there. You can find me through one of those channels. All right, thanks. That's it. I will see you in the other tutorials.